The photograph of the two girls standing beside the ruined cabin was the first image circulated through Harlan County in the summer of 1963. At a glance, the picture seemed like any other fragment of Appalachian hardship: a collapsed roof, a sagging doorway, two children coated in dust and silence. But for the people of Harlan, these weren't just two lost girls. They were the Dalton sisters, missing since 1952, presumed dead, buried in memory but never laid to rest. Their sudden reappearance raised a question that no one in the region was prepared to confront. How do two children vanish for 11 years, only to walk out of the forest as if time itself had bent around them? According to the sheriff's office, the girls were found just after sunrise on a narrow coal road used only by hunters and surveyors. Their dresses were threadbare, sun-faded, and several seasons out of place. Their hair had been cut unevenly, as if by someone with little practice. And yet, despite the intervening years, their faces matched the photographs from 1952 with unsettling precision. The youngest, Emma, still had the same off-center dimple. The older, Louise, still carried the same solemn eyes that had made her look older than her age even before she disappeared. It was as though the forest had swallowed them whole and preserved them in its darkness. The initial interviews were conducted in a quiet back room of the county clinic. Local authorities hoped for a quick explanation: a lost relative, an illegal adoption gone wrong, a runaway situation stretched beyond imagination. But the sisters insisted on a single story, repeated without hesitation. They had been living in a small cabin deep in the Appalachian woods with a man they called Thomas. They described him as patient, silent, and never angry unless the rules were broken. When pressed on what those rules were, the girls hesitated, then fell into the same phrase: "We don't want to say yet." The first inconsistency emerged within hours. No one in the Dalton family recognized the name Thomas. No neighbor recalled a stranger in the area during the early 1950s, and the location the girls described was impossible to pinpoint. They spoke of walking endless miles through pine stands, crossing streams that moved like mirrors, and following a path marked by a carved symbol on a tree. Yet when the sheriff's deputies attempted to retrace these directions, every trail dead-ended. No cabin appeared on property records, mining surveys, or historical maps. Every document suggested the same impossibility. No structure had stood in that part of the mountain for at least 3 decades. As word spread, the residents of Harlan reacted with a mix of awe, caution, and something resembling dread. Some whispered that the girls must have been coached. Others claimed it was a ploy to revive a long, cold tragedy. But those who had lived through the original search in 1952 found the situation harder to dismiss. They remembered the bloodhounds losing the scent within minutes, the storm that swept in the night after the disappearance, the eerie stillness that followed, as though the mountain itself had sealed the truth inside its ridges. The authorities decided the only logical step was to bring in outside expertise. A forestry consultant, an anthropologist from Lexington, and 2 retired coal surveyors were assigned to help locate any trace of habitation in the region the girls described. But before the investigation could begin, one detail in the sisters' story caught the attention of every official in the room. The girls claimed that Thomas always kept the cabin's door locked from the outside, even when he was away. It was not a home. They said it was a place they were meant to stay until the rules changed. This was the moment when the mystery deepened. The Dalton girls were no longer simply returned children. They were witnesses to an ordeal that no one could situate in reality, yet no one could fully disprove. Whatever had happened in those 11 lost years seemed to be rooted in a place that appeared on no map, belonged to no landowner, and resisted every attempt to be found. The search for the cabin began with confidence and ended, repeatedly, in silence. The investigative team, 2 deputies, the forestry consultant, and a surveyor who had mapped nearly every ridge of Harlan County, set out with the sisters. Descriptions written on a single sheet of legal paper. The directions were simple on the surface: follow the creek uphill until the water narrows. Take the path with the carved mark. Walk until the light changes. But each phrase, once tested against the terrain, dissolved into contradiction. The creek branched into three. The trails split and vanished. Light changed everywhere beneath the shifting canopy of the Appalachians. When the investigators brought the sisters along for a supervised walkthrough, the confusion only deepened. Emma pointed to a slope she swore they had climbed dozens of times, yet she could not recall which direction they had come from. Louise paused at clusters of trees, insisting that branches were missing, rocks had moved, or the forest was younger before. Their memories were clear in emotion but blurry in geography, as though the place they described had shifted while they were gone, or as if their years inside it had dissolved the forest's edges into something indistinguishable. Back at the sheriff's office, the team resorted to old property maps, coal company schematics, and WPA land surveys from the 1930s. Nothing showed a cabin within a 5-mile radius of the area the girls described. A retired miner recalled a hunting shed from his youth, but it had been demolished long before the Dalton sisters were born. An anthropologist suggested the possibility of a forgotten homestead, a family cabin left unrecorded during the Depression. But even that theory fell apart when the oldest surveyor traced the tree growth patterns in the region. The forest was too young. No structure could have stood there 11 years ago without leaving scarce foundation stones, path clearings, or changes in soil composition. Yet the land was uniformly untouched. The more the team searched, the more the community speculated. Some believed the girls were inventing a story to shield a family member. Others whispered about religious sects hidden in the mountains, stories that had long drifted through the region like smoke without source. But for every rumor, there was a counterweight. The Dalton girls were consistent. Their recollections matched each other. Their phrases, though vague, carried the rhythm of lived experience. They spoke of a routine held together by something stricter than simple fear, waking at dawn, gathering water from a spring that tasted like metal, and completing chores under the watchful presence of Thomas, who they claimed rarely raised his voice, yet whose rules never allowed forgetting. One moment during the interview stood out, an accidental detail that froze the room. Emma described the symbol carved on the cabin wall as something Thomas had told them to follow whenever they went outside. When asked how often they left the cabin alone, she answered without hesitation, only when he said the mountain was safe. No one could explain what that meant. Safe from what? Safe for whom? Louise added that Thomas always walked ahead of them, ensuring the path was clear. The investigative team could not reconcile this with the fact that no trail near the suspected area appeared recently maintained. Frustration grew as the search reached its 10th day. The forestry consultant suggested expanding the perimeter northward into steeper, less accessible terrain. The deputies declined. The slope was dangerous, and no known structure had ever been built in that direction. But the anthropologist insisted that the absence of evidence was precisely the point. If the cabin exists, she said, it exists where no one was meant to find it. Still, every attempt to reach further led to the same conclusion. The mountain held no cabin. Yet on the 11th day, something unexpected occurred. As the team prepared to suspend the search, the surveyor, normally stoic, called them over to a cluster of trees. At the base of one trunk, faint beneath layers of bark, was a shape that made the investigators lean in and fall silent. A geometric carving. Weathered, partial, but unmistakably similar to the symbol the Dalton sisters had described. It was the first physical detail that aligned with the girls' testimony. And it changed everything. The discovery of the carved symbol on the tree should have unified the investigation. Instead, it fractured it. Deputies argued that the marking could have been made by hunters decades earlier. The surveyor insisted it was older than the girls' disappearance, yet too crisp to be from the 1930s. The anthropologist photographed it repeatedly, noting the same thing the Dalton sisters had said. The symbol wasn't decorative, it was directional, a marker meant to be followed. But followed to what? The mountain offered no answer, only a long exhale of wind that seemed to erase every assumption as soon as it was formed. When investigators returned to the clinic with the photograph of the marking, the reaction from the sisters was immediate and visceral. Emma recoiled as though touched by something electric, her voice cracking as she whispered that it shouldn't be out here anymore. Louise, calmer but noticeably shaken, confirmed that the marking meant Thomas had changed the rules. When pressed for clarification, she said that the symbol only appeared when they were expected to stay inside the cabin for long stretches. It meant the surrounding woods were not ours to walk. What that implied and what threat it referred to remained maddeningly unclear. That night, behind closed doors, the girls were encouraged to give a full account of their years in the cabin. The statements were taken separately, but their details aligned with eerie precision. They described waking before dawn, preparing food from preserved jars, and being forbidden to open the door unless Thomas unlocked it. The cabin had only one window, and even that was covered most of the time with nailed boards, which Thomas removed only during summer. They learned to read from old, brittle books. They learned to sew using scraps of cloth. And they learned, above all else, obedience, and obedience they claimed was not enforced through violence, but through a system of consequences that neither sister could fully articulate. As the interviews deepened, another unsettling pattern emerged. Their sense of time inside the cabin was distorted. They struggled to separate months from years. Seasons blurred into vague recollections of light and temperature. Emma described winters that felt too short, while Louise recalled summers that never fully arrived. Their memories were rich in sensory detail: smoke from the stove, the metallic taste of the spring water, the smell of damp timber, but nearly void of chronology. Psychologists called in for consultation, suggested trauma as a possible cause. But privately, one doctor admitted the inconsistencies were not typical of trauma alone. It was as if the girls had lived in a place where time itself had been rationed. The identity of Thomas became the central question. The sisters described him as a man in his 40s, clean-shaven, with dark hair and a quiet, deliberate way of speaking. He never raised his voice, never struck them, never withheld food. But he kept them confined. He dictated their routines. And he forbade them to speak of the world beyond the mountain. When asked why they stayed, Louise answered simply, "Because leaving wasn't allowed," Emma added, in a voice thin with memory, "and because we didn't know if the mountain let people leave." The ambiguity of their statements frustrated investigators, but a deeper tension simmered beneath the surface. The Dalton family, already overwhelmed by the return of daughters they had mourned for more than a decade, struggled to reconcile the girls' story with their own memories. Louise and Emma spoke of being taken from a clearing. They used to play in, yet their mother insisted. They had never played anywhere near the deep woods. Their father denied ever meeting a man named Thomas, though the girls claimed he had been the one to warn them never to talk to strangers on the mountain. The contradictions multiplied. The emotional weight grew. And then came the most disquieting revelation of all. The sisters insisted the cabin had no path leading to it. The only way to reach it, they said, was to follow Thomas. When he walked, the path appeared. When he stopped, the forest closed. For the authorities, this statement marked the moment the investigation became untenable. But for the small team of specialists still holding onto the symbol carved in the tree, it signaled something else entirely. The possibility that the truth was hidden not by fiction, but by a landscape shaped by history, secrecy, and the quiet power of forgotten men. The discovery of the carved symbol should have pushed the investigation forward. Instead, it marked the point where the official search began to collapse under its own contradictions. Deputies were unwilling to pursue a lead that seemed to dissolve the closer they approached it. The county judge cited budgetary limits. Reporters, once eager for a sensational headline, shifted their attention when it became clear that the Dalton sisters' story would not deliver a simple villain or a clean narrative. But the specialists, the surveyor, the anthropologist, and the forestry consultant, refused to let the matter rest. For them, the symbol represented something incontrovertible, a bridge between testimony and terrain, a fragment of truth in a case defined by absence. Working independently, the team continued exploring areas far beyond where the deputies had searched. The terrain grew harsher, the slopes steeper, the vegetation thicker, landscapes where survey lines blurred and maps lost meaning. It was during one of these private expeditions that the surveyor made a second discovery, a patch of ground where the soil had been compacted in an unusual pattern, as though something heavy had once rested there. No foundation stones, no remains of a structure, just a silent indentation in the earth, framed by young trees that had grown in too quickly for the 11 years the girls described. The absence of ruins unsettled the anthropologist more than any physical relic could have. "A place disappears," she murmured, "only when someone intends for it to disappear." Meanwhile, the sisters' recollections grew sharper. Louise remembered that Thomas often left for long stretches, returning before dawn with supplies they never saw him gather. Emma admitted that their fear of leaving the cabin wasn't rooted in Thomas himself, but in what he said lived beyond the tree line. When asked to explain what that meant, she faltered, then repeated a phrase that had surfaced in earlier interviews. "The mountain has people who aren't people anymore." Investigators dismissed this as metaphor, a child's attempt to articulate threat. But the girls insisted that Thomas had taught them to listen for specific sounds, branches snapping in patterns, wind moving the wrong way through the trees. "He always knew when to lock the door," Louise said. "And he always knew when it wasn't safe to sleep." The authorities began to view the sisters' statements as evidence of collective delusion or manipulation. The family begged for privacy. Medical professionals recommended residential evaluation. Slowly, the Dalton sisters' truth was filed, minimized and transformed into a local legend. Two lost children who returned with stories too strange to accept. Officially, the case ended with insufficient evidence to substantiate claims. Unofficially, it ended with a silence that lingered across Harlan County like a low fog. Yet the specialists refused to move on. Months later, driven by professional obsession or moral obligation, the anthropologist returned to the mountain alone. She followed the same creek, the same ridge, the same direction of light described by the sisters. She found no cabin, no trail, no remnants. But she did find something else, a second carved symbol, older, fainter, nearly reclaimed by the bark. A match to the first. A sign that whatever the Dalton sisters remembered had not been imagined, not entirely. She brought her findings to the sheriff, who declined to reopen the case. She brought them to the Dalton family, who asked not to discuss the matter further. Eventually, she archived her notes in a university collection, where they remain largely unread. Her report ends with a single sentence that has since become the quiet thesis of this story. If the cabin cannot be found, it is because it was built to be forgotten. As for Emma and Louise, their lives continued in the fragile rhythm of survivors whose truth was never granted legitimacy. They grew older, moved away, and spoke rarely, at least publicly, about their years on the mountain. But those who remained close to them reported the same lingering habit. The sisters avoided forests. They never walked near tree lines. And whenever they passed carved initials on old wood, they looked away too quickly, as though any mark, symbolic or innocent, might still lead back to the place they insisted had shaped 11 lost years. And so the mystery of the Dalton sisters settled into a permanent, uneasy equilibrium. A truth divided between official disbelief and personal memory. A landscape that swallowed its own evidence. A cabin that left no ruins. And a symbol carved in bark that continues to outlast every explanation offered in its place.